This unit discusses risk. We're going to divide it into two parts. The first part of the presentation, for the presentation materials, will be looking at how to assess risk and how to categorize things and look at what your assets are and things like that and the likelihood of risk. And in the second presentation, we're going to talk about how to mitigate risk, so ways we can reduce risk. So let's get started. So risk. Basically, risk is any situation that involves exposure to some type of danger. So that danger could be the result of natural disasters. It could be a man-made disaster. It could be attackers trying to access your data and so forth and so on. So risk is really any danger, anything that could happen that would adversely affect our digital infrastructure. Not all events are risks. So some things would be a false positive, meaning that it appears to be a risk, but it turns out that there's very little risk of that. For example, you might have a false negative, which is an event that does not appear to be a risk, but actually turns out to be a risk. So it's very important to look at all these different events that you brainstorm and try to figure out whether or not they are actually a risk, or maybe there are hidden risks that you're not aware of. There are two terms in your book that I really couldn't fit into the continuity of my presentation, so I'll start with these two terms first, which was residual risk, which I don't see in too many textbooks, but basically residual risk is the amount of risk that remains to an asset even after the desired controls are implemented. So in other words, one of our goals with risk management is to identify as many risks as we can and then mitigate those risks and prioritize those risks. And in some cases, we look at our risk appetite, which is the risks that we're willing to accept. But if we're not willing to accept the risk, we try to mitigate it with whatever means possible, and whatever risk is left is the residual risk. So again, these are two terms that are from your textbook. I just wanted to talk briefly about those two terms. So risk management basically comes down to three things. Risk identification, which is where we categorize and inventory all of the assets. So anything that's worth anything to us. Doesn't necessarily have to be infrastructure like routers, switches, firewall servers, and so forth. It could be information. It could be our reputation. So there's lots of things that we can look at. We try to classify. So once we identify and inventory the assets, we try to classify them and assign them some sort of a value. And then we look at what all the threats are to those assets. So here's all of our assets. What are all the possible threats to those assets? So we look at that as well. And then we try to assess what the vulnerabilities are. Once we have a good idea of what our risks are and what our assets are, we assess those risks. So we determine how often that loss might happen. We try to determine the magnitude of the loss. In other words, how much is it going to cost us? So how often it happens, how much it's going to cost, and then we calculate the risk. And then we assess the acceptability of that risk and what we're willing to do to mitigate that risk. So we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes. And then finally, we have risk control, which is selecting a strategy to control risk. We try to justify those controls to management and to anyone who's a stakeholder in the organization. And then we implement, monitor, and assess those controls over time. And we'll talk about that last in the second presentation. So first, identifying assets. There are lots of things that could be an asset. I touched on this just a few minutes ago. So some traditional system components, people, procedures, data, software, hardware, all of those things could be assets. So basically, when we're trying to identify assets, we're trying to brainstorm all of the things in the organization that could be an asset, or anything that is of value to the organization. We're trying to brainstorm all that stuff. Anything that we're going to miss if we lose it, right? If we lose our data, we're going to miss it. If we lose people, we're going to miss them. If we lose any hardware or any capital equipment, of course, we're going to miss that stuff as well. So that's what we're looking at. Once we identify all of these different assets, all of these things that are worth something to us, then we have to assign some value to them. So some tips from your textbook. They give you kind of a checklist of things you can consider when you're trying to assign value. And this is more so not a specific value, but we're talking here about the weighted value of something. What's the most important thing to your organization? And then what's the second most important thing to the organization? So some questions you can ask yourself is, for each asset, is how critical is it to the success of the organization? If you didn't have it, would it be catastrophic to the organization, regardless of what it costs? Does it generate revenue for the organization? What is the replacement cost if we lose it? What's our liability exposure or embarrassment, for example? So for example, losing data. I work a lot in healthcare, and if we lose, patients' data, certainly a pretty big liability exposure there. If the patient finds out, they could sue. We have to notify patients that we've lost their data. That's certainly some embarrassment factor there. People will think twice about providing their information to us if we consistently lose it. What was the cost to create that data? What's the value that we have from the maintenance of this asset? So, when I think about this, I think about driving a car, right? So I don't know if anyone's ever had this happen, but I'm sure everybody knows somebody who bought a car, drove it off the lot, and then it gets, hit by a truck. But here's another scenario for you. What if you have an older car, and older cars break down periodically. So you've got an older car. I've got a car that's almost 17 years old. I still drive my old Jeep. It's 17 years old. I love the thing. I can't get rid of it. My favorite car. But every time something breaks, I assess whether it's worth it to fix it or not. I think, okay, this is going to be $900 to fix whatever it is that broke. Do I fix it, or do I say, that's it, I'm done with this car because I've sunk so much money into it over the last 20 years? So that's kind of the value that we get from the maintenance of that vehicle. So, for example, I might spend $900 or $1,000 to maintain that old car. So if I just spent $900 to fix my car, and then it gets totaled in a car accident, the insurance companies, there's no way they're going to give me $900 for this old Jeep. But to me, it's going to be worth $900. So maybe I want to make sure I insure it for that value, although they really won't let you do that. But in most insurance, we can do that, which we'll talk about that later on. So what is the value of the information? So information certainly has value, like intellectual property. And what is the cost to protect that asset? So all of these things we can consider to try to figure out what the weighted value, or how valuable is this thing to us that we're talking about the risk of. So once we brainstorm all that stuff, you could create a table and put a weighted score of the value of each thing that you identify. So you could put a weighted value, so it'll help you identify what is the most important thing to you. And you can assign weights to different factors. For example, you could have a weight for the impact to the revenue. You could have a weight for the impact to profitability, a weight for the impact to public image. So, for example, in this example you're looking at here, they assigned a 30% weight to revenue, 40% weight to profitability, and a 30% weight to public image. So in this example, whoever created this table considered public image to be of equal importance to revenue. But profitability was, a little less than those two combined. So then they assigned some sort of a metric to each one of those things that they identified. So all the assets they identify, they assign a metric to it, multiply it by the weight, and you get a weighted score. So here it becomes pretty obvious that the most important thing, the most valuable asset for them to protect, is the customer order coming in from SSL. And the least valuable thing for them to protect is EDI document set 2 for supplier fulfillment advice inbound, whatever that is. So that's a simple example for you. And of course, this would be a much larger table in the real world. So for a threat assessment, not only do we want to assess the value of all of this stuff, but we also want to look at what are all the possible threats to all of these assets. So here's an example of some threats that you might consider. So compromises to intellectual property, espionage or trespass, forces of nature, human error. These look familiar, right? So we already talked about threats in the previous unit. So in the previous unit, if you refer back to all the threats we talked about in the previous unit when we're doing risk assessment, we want to look at all those threats and assess what is the likelihood of these threats and how would it affect all of these assets that we've identified. So again, you can make yourself a table or whatever, somehow try to figure out what those threats are. What are the most likely threats for those assets? Then we can classify all of our risks. So this is an example of a table from your textbook of different risk categories: strategic, compliance, financial, operational, environment, technical, managerial. So these are just classifications. Again, it's just another technique we have to try to assess and evaluate what all of these assets are, what their value is to us. So this is just a classification scheme. So finally, once we get all of this stuff, so up until this point, and this is, by the way, so in that first slide I showed you, there were 3 boxes at the top. If you refer back to that, you can pause the video and go back and you'll see those 3 boxes. The first box, we identify all of our risks. So we're identifying our assets, we're identifying the threats, we're identifying the vulnerabilities, right? We're trying to take stock of what we have to protect. The next step, the second box, was our risk assessment. So once we know what we have, once we know what those threats are, we can combine that. We can put all that together and come up with our risk assessment. So one of the things we're going to look at is the loss frequency. So loss frequency is the likelihood of a threat times the number of occurrences in a finite time period. So we're trying to figure out how often is this loss going to happen. So some ways that we can figure this out. Your book doesn't really talk about this too much. The book just says magically find the likelihood of the event, but there's certainly historic data that can tell you the likelihood of a risk. So for example, if you're looking at the threat of a fire, there's pretty established historic evidence of how often you might have a fire. Insurance companies are really good at figuring out what the likelihood of a building burning down exactly is based on all the different factors, based on all of the different risk factors. So that's one way you could do that. And in IT, we have some of that historic data now. 20 years ago we didn't, but today we do have a lot of that historic data. And a lot of times we just have a good feeling. We kind of know, what is the likelihood that someone's going to get a virus or ransomware and so forth and so on. So we could figure that out from historic data. In other words, our previous experience with that risk. One thing that your book doesn't talk about, but mean time between failure, mean time to failure, almost a lot of the capital, and this really only applies to capital or to infrastructure and devices and things like that, but most IT devices that you buy will be rated or have some rating. If they're known to fail, they'll have some kind of rating to tell you exactly or within some range of when you can expect that to fail. So when the manufacturer expects that item to fail, when you go to the store and buy a light bulb, now LED light bulbs are all the rage. And if you go to the store to buy an LED light bulb, one thing you'll notice is every box will tell you 20,000 hours or 60,000 hours or 10,000 hours. Light bulbs that are more expensive generally last more hours, which is amazing that they last 60,000 hours. Some of these LEDs, that's, you can probably run them for 20 years, although we have yet to see if they'll last that long. But IT assets do the same thing. They'll tell you roughly how long you can expect that object to last. So mean time to failure is one spec you could look at to see what is the likelihood of the loss of that device or a failure of that device. And a hard drive failure could be a catastrophic failure if you don't mitigate against that. And we'll talk about ways to mitigate those types of failures later on. So again, MTTF or MTBF, mean time between failure, are 2 things you can look at. Or you can just look at the warranty. It seems like everything fails the day after the warranty expires. Failure in time is another number. It can report the number of expected failures per 1 billion hours of operation for a device. So some devices will give you a failure in time rating. And then an annualized rate of occurrence is the likelihood of the risk occurring within 1 year. So a good example of that would be something like a fire. A kind of a shorthand for fire is you can expect most buildings to burn down once every 100 years. So every 100 years, you're going to get a catastrophic fire. Maybe the whole building won't burn down, but a portion of it, or there'll be some damage from a fire every 100 years. That's just a little shorthand. So that means the likelihood in any 1 year of that happening, right? If every 100 years there's a fire, that means that in 1 year, the likelihood of it happening might be 1%. So that would be the annualized rate of occurrence, 1%. And that's a good technique to figure out what the loss frequency is, to use that annualized rate of occurrence. And I'll revisit that here in just a few minutes on the same slide. We'll talk about that again. Your book doesn't really give you a good, clear way to do that. It doesn't really talk about a clear way to calculate that. But my example of a fire, that's basically how you do it. You say, in X number of years, how often does it happen? And then you use that to extrapolate to 1 year. So annualized meaning 1 year. And your book doesn't say that. That's the part that your book falls short on. They talk about loss frequency, but they don't make it clear that you're trying to calculate that within a year to get a consistent number. In other words, if you calculate that a fire happens every 1 in 100 years and a disk failure happens once every 30 days in a data center, those are very different time spans. So the once every 30 days, if it were annualized, would be 12 times a year, whereas the fire would be 1% of a year, right? And those are very different AROs. So it's kind of comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges if you don't convert that. So the loss magnitude is the way that we calculate the value of that loss. There are two basic methods to calculate loss magnitude. The first one, and using the word calculate is probably a stretch here, but qualitative risk calculation is using an educated guess based on observations. It's based on your experience. So you really don't know the hard numbers with qualitative risk calculation. You're really using your experience and your background to try to evaluate. So where would you use this? Things like data, right? And information. What exactly is your customer list worth? That's harder to wrap a hard number around. You buy a server at Best Buy. Well, nobody buys them at Best Buy, but if you went to Best Buy and bought a computer, you know how much it's worth. It's got a price tag on it, right? And you can calculate boy, it's tax season. I forget what they call that, but you can calculate, the reduction in that value over time. Depreciation, sorry. So you can calculate things like depreciation. But for some things, we really can't do that. It's not so obvious. So that's what qualitative risk calculation is. It's using an educated or a best guess. There was this movie back in the 90s called The Hudsucker Proxy, and this always makes me think of a scene in The Hudsucker Proxy. So this guy invents the hula hoop. Nobody knows what it is yet, but he invents the hula hoop. He goes around showing everyone a picture of a circle and says, "Look what I invented," and everybody's like, "What the heck is that?" So he works for this big company, and it's kind of a satire, this movie. It's a dark comedy, and in one scene in the movie, they're showing, the whole process to develop this product. And, they show R&D and all that stuff. In one scene, they show them trying to figure out how much it's going to cost. Well, there's no words in this part of the movie. All you see is a whole bunch of people sitting at desks with a big sign that says, "What will this cost?" And then a guy comes up and shows the head accountant, a book that says 79 cents. He shakes his head no, so the guy changes puts a 1 in front of the 79 cents. So it's $1.79. He says, that's a little better. So that's very qualitative. It's, it's just somebody pulling a number out and then saying, this is what it's going to cost, right? So that's qualitative risk calculation. Now, quantitative is much easier. We have hard numbers. We have real value. You have a server, you know what it costs, you know what its value is. If you have a car, you know roughly what the value of your car is. You can go on bluebook.com, put in the year, make, and model. The only thing that's really subjective is the condition of the vehicle, good, perfect, or whatever, or fair. You put that in, it tells you the exact value of that asset. So quantitative risk calculation is when we know the exact value of something. So again, we have those two techniques for trying to calculate the magnitude. Once we have the frequency of loss and the magnitude of the loss, then we can figure out what the impact. All of this stuff, this whole exercise I've talked about, all the way up to this point, was really to arrive at a risk impact. So the risk impact is basically, how is this risk or incident going to affect our organization? What's it going to do to us? What's it going to cost to us? One thing, your book doesn't really talk about this, but single loss expectancy is one value that's thrown around in risk assessment. So it's the expected monetary loss every time a risk occurs, and it's computed by multiplying the value by the exposure factor, or EF, the exposure factor. And then the other one is the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE, which is the one that I'm more familiar with. So we already talked about the annualized rate of occurrence. That goes along with the annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. And again, this is all to get to objective numbers for comparing or understanding what your risk is for any given asset. So one way you would calculate this is, let's say I know that a fire occurs every 100 years. And I know that if I were to lose my data center, for example, it would be a $1.2 million loss of all of the assets that are wrapped into that data center. So $1.2 million. If I take the yearly risk, or the annualized rate of occurrence, which is 1%, right? So if the fire happens every 100 years, that's 1 divided by 100, which is 1%. So that's a 1% annualized rate of occurrence times the damage, or the magnitude, which in this case is $1.2 million. So that means my yearly exposure is $12,000. So why would I use that number? How would I use that number? That means that the aggregate of my expenses to protect my data center should probably not be more than $12,000. So all of the things that I do to mitigate that risk, if I'm spending more than $12,000, that might be kind of foolish. My Jeep, my old Jeep I keep talking about, is a great example of that. My Jeep is probably worth maybe $1,000 if I sold it used. But the insurance for my Jeep, if I have full coverage on that old car, they charge me like $600, $700, which is an awful lot of money, considering that the thing is only worth about $1,000. So, I could lose my whole car and it wouldn't matter. But liability-only insurance only costs me like $300. So, and you have to have liability. I live in New Jersey. If you don't have liability, it's, bad news. And it's a good idea to have liability, because if I hit somebody else with my car, I want to be protected from having to pay for their damage. God forbid I hit a Maserati or something, right? So if I were to calculate, my annualized loss expectancy, I can almost guarantee you that it's a lot less than full coverage for that Jeep. So it's foolish for me to pay for full coverage. I could just go buy another beat up old Jeep Cherokee for $900 instead of spending that money on insurance every year. So same thing with our data center, same thing with our assets, same thing with all the stuff we're talking about. If you calculate that. And by the way, insurance companies are really good at this. They know exactly what that annualized loss expectancy is, and they make sure that their rates are, competitive to that ALE. But if you identify the ALE is much more than your cost to mitigate that risk, maybe you just accept that risk. So again, this is just a way to objectively identify all of the stuff that we've talked about, objectively identify what all of your risks are, the likelihood of that risk occurring, all the things that could possibly cause that risk. So once we understand the threats, once we understand what the assets are and what they're worth, we can put those two together to get the impact of a loss. So stay tuned for the next presentation, and where we'll cover mitigating risk.